The golden rule of Hezbollah's Islamic Jihad organization is the less you know, the better. Iran and Hezbollah are always most dangerous where their interests really, really intersect and they operate closely together. And as much as the United States wants to pivot from the Middle East to Asia, I think that U.S. interests are still so significant in the region that there's a lot more that's going to have to be done to push back on this new normal Iran is trying to create.
What is different about Hezbollah today over a month and a half ago?
We just don't know. But I think it is safe to assume that
I can only imagine how much you have going on, especially over the last few months, really end of July up through today, or at least late September, early October. I mean, that was quite a significant series of events that in sequence is something that I think will be studied for decades, if not centuries to come. But before we get to that, let's do a little bit of background. Hezbollah beginnings. Let's take people, because I want to get up to today, but for people who are still a little bit confused about Hamas, Hezbollah, Iranian proxies, Quds Force, IRGC, all these things are a little confusing. I know they concentrate in a certain part of the world, but when we talk about Hezbollah and its beginnings, what can you talk about as far as the lead in that got us up to the terrorist organization that we knew up until, I'd say, a month and a half ago? Well, it looks a little different today, I'd say, than it did a month and a half ago. But take us up to that point. What Hezbollah beginnings? The new 1911X from Sig Sauer, a balance of classic 1911 engineering and style with modern upgrades, including an ultra-low profile direct mount optic capability designed with the new Romeo X red dot optic. X-Ray 3 day-night sights for extreme sight picture visibility, an adjustable flat blade trigger and custom G10 grip panels from LOK Grips. Designed with a full 1913 rail and stainless steel frame with undercut trigger guard, an extended ambidextrous manual safety and slide stop, chambered in classic 45 ACP. Sig Sauer 1911X. Classic design meets modern innovation. Introducing the new Jacquard BCM Mod 4 grip. Reduced angle for improved ergonomics and trigger control. New aggressive grip texture to maximize traction. Extended forward tang to close the gap between the trigger guard and pistol grip. High-rise beaver tail style backstrap. Open bottom to minimize weight. Includes mounting hardware for mil-spec lower receivers. Manufactured in the USA from high-quality impact-resistant polymers. Go to BravoCompanyUSA.com and get yours today.
Look, so we'll get to this later, but it's safe to say the Hezbollah that existed even just a few weeks ago doesn't exist today. But it took a long time for Hezbollah to get to the point that it was just a few weeks ago. And it goes back to the early 1980s. It's a little weird telling the guy who just published the book on the Beirut bombings. Let me tell you about the Beirut bombings, but I'm going to. Because, as you know, Hezbollah didn't officially declare its existence until 1985. And it issued what it called its open letter and set out its ideology and its goals, made it clear that it believed in Waliyat al-Faqih, the rule of the jurisprudent, this innovation that the supreme leader of Iran produced with the Islamic Revolution in Iran, that the supreme leader of Iran is the leader of the faithful on planet Earth, the mouth of God. And maybe not every Hezbollah, fanboy follows that, but Hezbollah surely does. And so you can see them doing things that might not be in their immediate best interest or compete with other interests they have. Think later on going to fight in Syria, though that would distract them from fighting Israel. And that's them following the rule of the jurisprudent. That goes back to the very, very beginning. But it's critical to understand, as you lay out in your book, that Hezbollah existed beforehand. It was founded in 1982. This is not a matter of debate. We have declassified U.S. intelligence, German, others. In fact, you can look at the declassified U.S. intelligence and watch as intelligence analysts and policymakers are trying to make sense. Who are all these guys operating under all these different names. It very much reminds me of what was happening in the early days of the revolution in Syria, much more recently, as like every other Tuesday, groups are changing their names and changing alliances. In the early days, in the early 1980s in Lebanon, Hezbollah was operating under names, the Press of the Earth, Islamic Jihad Organization, Holy War, all kinds of names, which the intelligence community started describing as cover names or fronts. And then they officially announced themselves as Hezbollah, literally the party of God, of which now Islamic Jihad Organization, its terrorist wing, was a component. More recently, the group itself calls this entity Unit 910. Europeans and some others still refer to it as the External Security Organization. Islamic Jihad Organization, IJO, External Security Organization, ESO, Unit 910. These are all different names for Hezbollah's international terrorist wing. And so when Hezbollah first decided to start targeting Western interests, it was in Lebanon. And we now know from material that was declassified and used in open court here in Washington, D.C., that in particular, in the case of the Marine barracks bombings, there was a command from the Iranian Ministry of Intelligence and Security, the MOIS, their version of the CIA, to their ambassador in Syria to instruct Mr. Moussaoui, who was already kind of broken with the other major Shia group Amal, created the Islamic Amal, and Islamic Amal just kind of folded into the hierarchy of what became Hezbollah, instructing Moussaoui to carry out a spectacular action targeting the U.S. Marines. Now, they'd already targeted the U.S. Embassy. They would target the U.S. Embassy annex again. Of course, they hit the French military. They tried but failed to hit the Italian military. Lots and lots of abductions. Bill Buckley, Bob Ames, all kinds of different things over a long period of time. But what's critical is that when Hezbollah made that first pivot towards targeting Western interests, as opposed to others in Lebanon or the Israelis, it was at the behest of Iran. That hasn't changed. Soon they are tasked with carrying out attacks targeting U.S. and French interests in Kuwait because of reflagging of Iraqi oil during the Iran-Iraq War, and France and the U.S. supporting Saddam Hussein. Next, you see them operating in Europe, then South America, and it just kind of goes from there. But it all starts in the early 1980s.
Yeah, and I want to talk to you about some of those more international, the international capability of Hezbollah, because I want to come back to that today. And I want to ask you farther on down the line here what they might be capable of still today, having been hit so hard in Lebanon, Syria, and other places around the Middle East by Israel over the last couple months. But this book right here, Hezbollah, needs to be on anyone's shelf who's a student of history, of terrorism, of the Middle East, a citizen who just wants to be more informed as they should be before they walk into the voting booth, or be able to understand a little bit more about what is going on over there in Israel, in Lebanon, Syria, Iran, and how all these things piece together. This is foundational right here. This is a fantastic work. I learned so many new things in here that I didn't know, and I've been clued into this since my earliest days as a kid, but just fantastic. But internationally, when we talk about Hezbollah, most people think of it as something in the Middle East. Even if they don't know the specifics, that's what they think of. A few people who have been paying attention over the years, and in the 80s and 90s and 2000s, reading Time or Newsweek, or they'd see Hezbollah pop up. Maybe they'll remember that it popped up internationally here and there, but they have some very deep tentacles around the world. You mentioned its beginnings in Lebanon, really as a proxy of Iran, but we have Kuwait Airways Flight 221, a hit on the Kuwaiti Emir in 1985. We have another Kuwaiti Airlines Flight 442 in 1988, TWA 847, of course, which that's the one people who grew up in the 80s might really remember from being on the covers of those magazines back then. Buenos Aires, narco-terrorism, Khobar Towers. I want to talk to you about some of this. So when you think about Hezbollah more internationally, what can you tell us about its capabilities there and how they grew over time?
Jack, how much time do you have?
I know.
This to be clear, really is the crux of the book, right? Mm-hmm. Because what I found was that there was actually a lot of information to be found about Hezbollah activities in Lebanon if you wanted to get on Google and do that. Mm-hmm. Because Hezbollah actually has a lot of activities that it engages in Lebanon that are overt or semi-overt, some of which it really wants you to know about. Its religious activities, its social welfare activities, the schools, their version of the Boy Scouts, which is maybe less altruistic, but programs for kids, all of that. And then there's stuff they don't want you to know about. When I started my podcast on Hezbollah, I called it Breaking Hezbollah's Golden Rule. And the reason is I testified in a Hezbollah case in the Southern District of New York against involving a guy named Ali Karani, who was subsequently convicted. He's serving a long time in jail. And he tells the FBI about all the surveillance he's done in New York, et cetera, but it wasn't to do stuff now, it was just to report back to Lebanon, he says. FBI asks him, so under what circumstances, asks him, so tell me more about, your handler. And he says, well, I asked my handler at one point, who was involved in Hezbollah plots in Cyprus and in Bulgaria, tell me more about your time there. And the guy said to me, no. The golden rule of Hezbollah's Islamic Jihad organization is the less you know, the better. And so in the podcast, we try and break this rule. But they also asked him, so under what circumstance you think you might be asked to use all this surveillance that you've done? And he said, I don't know, maybe if the U.S. was perceived to be involved in, a growing war with Iran, or certainly if Hassan Nasrallah, the Secretary General, was killed. You take those two things, plus the fact, as you intimated earlier, that most of the ways that Hezbollah might want to react to what's going on today has been denied to it. Most of their rockets, most of their cross-border raid, the forward deployed weapons, this is what's left to them. And they're really, really good at it because they've been doing this stuff around the world for a very, very long time. So there's multiple levels. Hezbollah has actual, as if, card-carrying members. They don't have membership cards, but as if highly trained individuals. They will often come in at the last minute and do the last bit of the operation, but they will rely on local elements that will include sympathizers and supporters, some of whom are living within diaspora communities, some of whom have been sent to live in diaspora communities to be a term one of them used. I hate the term because it's too Hollywood, but one Hezbollah guy described himself as a sleeper cell. And from Europe to South America to Asia. I mean, one of the most incredible chapters for me as the author in my book was getting into the history, which goes quite recent as well, of Hezbollah activities in Southeast Asia, in Singapore, in Thailand. As you said, most people are aware of the Hezbollah bombing of the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires, and then about a year and a half later, the bombing in 1992, and about a year and a half later, in 1994, the bombing of the Amia Jewish Community Center. Almost nobody knew that in between, Hezbollah came this close to blowing up the Israeli embassy in Bangkok, except that the suicide bomber got into a fender bender with a rickshaw on his way to the suicide bombing in rush hour traffic, freaked out and ran away. And it's an incredible, incredible story. So they've been building up capabilities to carry out operations, to raise funds, to procure weapons around the world. And it just drove me crazy as someone who had worked these issues in government, then left government, and it was so well known in government with the resources and focus there. But then you get into the open source world and you have people saying, yeah, I know that, some people say Hezbollah does some bad things around the world, but I just don't believe it. And you Google it and there's not a whole lot of stuff there. Turns out a lot of it was unclassified. You just had to get the court documents. You had to talk to people. So it wasn't an easy lift. The research for the book, the original version of the book, was 9 years. But at the end of which, we had a ton of information, so much actually, I had to cut 40,000 words from the book because it was too long.
40, that's a lot.
That's a short
for
book.
People that 40,000. Yeah, exactly. Certainly a longer novella, I guess. That's pretty serious. But maybe take us through Buenos Aires, because it kind of highlights things that they tried to do elsewhere and may be capable of doing in the future. Internationally.
Absolutely. So there are a bunch of themes that jump out at me from the two plots in Buenos Aires, and there's a lot more open source on the second plot in 1994, where they blew up the Amia Jewish Community Center. By the way, the next day they took down a commuter airliner to Panama A lot less has been out there about that, but that's also a known fact. We have the name of the Hezbollah suicide bomber. Actually, FBI just sent out a new request for information just about a week or two ago on that old cold case, and a rewards for justice from the State Department went out about that. But the bombing of Amiya is really telling for there are a few key things that jump out at me. One is Iran and Hezbollah are always most dangerous where their interests really, really intersect and they operate closely together. So there are times when the Iranians will go off and do things on their own. Look at these recent plots that have been exposed to kill people here in the United States, whether it's President-elect Trump or dissidents like Masih Alinejad. Some of those types of plots historically Hezbollah has been involved in too, but not all of them. Hezbollah also does plots on its own, like when they blew up the bus of Israeli tourists in Burgas, Bulgaria, or when they were stockpiling explosives for plots in Cyprus and elsewhere in Europe. But in 1994 in Buenos Aires, they worked hand in glove. So you had Iranian operatives, you had Hezbollah operatives, you had a Hezbollah suicide bomber, and they were incredibly skilled, and it made them very, very dangerous. There are a few things that jump out that you see Hezbollah still do today. They used a lot of local networks, and then they brought in the suicide bomber and the kind of commanders from the outside in just days before, and in hours before or after the event, they flew out from different airports in different ways. Like tracking Hezbollah travel patterns to me is fascinating. I have an online interactive map and timeline of Hezbollah activities around the world. One of the categories you can click on to track is travel patterns. The second thing is there's some specific tactical modus operandi that we keep seeing over and over again. So a bunch of years ago, I was at an international conference and I gave a talk about the stuff. I get pulled over by DEA, Drug Enforcement Administration agents based in Cyprus. And they said, can we just please have 10 minutes of your time? So we go into a room and they said, look, we don't want to get too much into our case, but we got a case where there's a guy and they keep doing surveillance of random parking lots. And we can't figure out what's with the parking lots. And I said, well, that actually makes me a little concerned, because if you go back to 1994 in particular and cases since, what they would do is find a parking garage near the target, fairly close to the target, and then a day or two beforehand park the car bomb or truck bomb in that parking lot so that they're nearby. They would make sure, and they do surveillance for things like, can you go in and out as many times as you want during the day? Is there a human being there, or is it just an automated machine? Are there cameras in the garage? Are there cameras on the streets? Is it well lit? And then the day of the actual attack, they just walk in, drive the car out, and then they're, 2, 3, max 4 minutes away from the target, and increases the likelihood that they don't get stopped on the way. I said, so what I would do if I were you is I'd draw concentric circles around those parking lots, and I'd see what targets have you got that Hezbollah or someone else might be interested in. And so there's a lot of different things like that. The last one I would say is the use of front companies. Both the Iranians and the Hezbollah operatives, who were working, as I said, very closely together, set up a variety of front companies. Iran imports a tremendous amount of meat and poultry, and they were at the time from Argentina. They set up an import-export company for meat and poultry that actually was doing that, but also provided other services for this operative network. Hezbollah also set up some companies that authorities only really tracked and found out about after the fact. And so there are a variety of different things that we saw then, looking in retrospect, that became only more obvious as we really dug into it. And the final thing is that they have a preference for operating in places where law enforcement is maybe not as advanced, border security is a little more lax. They will operate in places where we're really capable. Like I said, they've never carried out an attack in the United States to date, knock on wood, but they've done lots of surveillance here. Like they've set the groundwork so that if there's a decision is ever made, they could do it. But they really liked the ability to be able to bribe people to, the investigation in Argentina was muddled from the very, very beginning. Over time, it became very clear who carried it out. But even then, the chief prosecutor who kind of tied the bow over the case was assassinated the night before he was supposed to go speak before Parliament. So there's a lot of lessons to be learned from each of these cases. 94 bombing of AMIA Jewish Community Center in Buenos Aires in particular, because there's a lot of information about it. But that's one of the reasons I really tried to dig in as much as possible into that case. 2 years later, the bombing of Khobar Towers in the eastern province of Saudi Arabia, and others, because it just gave so much information about how they were doing things, how they operated. That's the meat and potatoes that we need to be able to identify and then frustrate those activities.
Yeah, when you say no activities other than surveillance in the United States, I have the book upstairs and I haven't had a chance to read it. I've been a little busy lately, but it's in my stack. It's Salman Rushdie's latest book about I think it's really his revelations about being stabbed, almost dying, losing his eye, stabbed in the neck by somebody at a book event. I think it's 2 years ago now.
Chautauqua, New York.
Yeah, that's it, right, in New York. Did that end up being a crazy person, or was that someone who was influenced or was inspired by, or was it an actual operative, or what? Would you know anything about that? I just haven't read the book yet, but talking about Hezbollah and the connection to Iran and Salman Rushdie, Satanic Verses, of course, and the fatwa and all of this. I mean, it's been a lot of years since the late 80s when that fatwa came out for writing the Satanic Verses. But what was that connected at all to Hezbollah or other terrorist organization? I don't know.
I don't want to jump the shark on a case that's still yet to go to trial, innocent until proven guilty and all that. But in this case, you had someone who appeared to be, or let's put it this way, the prosecutors are charging, was acting out on, in an effort to act on and to carry out the fatwa, the religious edict to assassinate Salman Rushdie that still stands, issued by the previous supreme leader of Iran. There's a bounty that Iranian government-run quote-unquote charitable organizations have put up to as a bounty for this. That's never been rescinded. There have been U.S. Department of Treasury designations of some of those entities pointing to this and noting that the bounty and the fatwa have never been rescinded. And then the individual who has been arrested and again has yet to stand trial reportedly went to Lebanon, where he has family, and authorities were concerned about who he might have met there, what might have happened to have made him, it appears, after that trip, decide that something like this is what he wanted to do. So don't want to jump the shark on that, but to my mind, if it ends up being an Iran Hezbollah connected type of thing, what you're looking at is kind of a combination between your kind of homegrown violent extremist, your lone offender who's sort of acting on their own, but also had some touch points perhaps with people who might have put him on a path.
Yeah. Do you worry about that? Having written a book titled Hezbollah, that for your safety, family safety, that sort of a thing?
Not personally. I think that Hezbollah has bigger fish to fry. You
think that was Salman Rushdie though too. You think about how long ago
there's no fatwa on me. I haven't written the guy who's now the Secretary General of Hezbollah, Naim Qassem, who for years was the deputy and has always been much more of a kind of theological figure, academic type, wrote his own book about Hezbollah, and was not the first choice to succeed Hassan Nasrallah when he was killed by the Israelis. But then the Israelis killed Hashem Safiuddin, who was the preferred candidate. And so Naim Qassem is kind of by default the Secretary General, although there are reportedly some very senior running Quds Force officials who are now in Lebanon kind of helping him, let's say. Mm-hmm. But about a year and a half or so ago, maybe 2 years ago, Naim Qassem did go on Hezbollah's Al-Manar television and talked about me by name for about 22 minutes. He talked about, didn't mention the book or the podcast or the map specifically, which kind of annoyed me. Could at least plug my stuff, right?
Seriously.
But basically said this guy does all this stuff and he's a shill for the U.S. government and he'll say anything they say. But even he'll say in some of his cases they weren't convicted. And anyway, he didn't much like the fact that I'm Jewish either. anyway, I don't really. I take my precautions, but the bottom line is that Hezbollah's got bigger fish to fry, especially right now.
Yeah. Well, I guess there is that, but still. Tell me about Unit 3800, Hezbollah operations in Iraq.
Okay, so the war in Iraq gives Iran a headache and an opportunity, right? Iraq is literally much, much closer to Iran. They share a very long border. They share a history of the Iran-Iraq War. And while Iran has an interest in fomenting unrest in countries around the region where there are Shia minorities, in Iraq, it's really much more of an immediate national security prerogative from the Iranian perspective to have an Iraq that is kind of under its thumb, under its influence, with obviously a very significant majority Shia population. So in the context of the Iran-Iraq War, Iran did a bunch of things. It basically supported all kinds of groups, mostly Shia, but some Sunni as well. Of course, Iran is Shia. Some of these groups were just assassins, and they got lots of weapons and EFPs, explosive forward penetrators, that punched through our armored vehicles. I've testified in a bunch of cases that have centered around that, all the way to groups that were to engage in no militant activity, but were just to be political in their activities, and everything in between. And the idea was that whoever came out on top in Iraq, Iran would have some allies. In order to create more capable Iraqi Shia militias, Iran turned to Hezbollah. And Hezbollah established a dedicated unit for its activities in Iraq called Unit 3800. This involved training, but also some operations of their own. The number two, some would say number three, but one of the most important people for Hezbollah, and this was a guy named Ali Musa Dakduk al-Musawi. He reportedly was killed just this weekend in a strike in Syria. He was arrested by U.S. forces. He was indicted in the United States. When U.S. forces left under the agreement with Iraq, he was transferred to the Iraqis. We wanted him extradited to the United States for a variety of incidents, including attacks on Americans, and they instead released him to the Iranians. He flew back to Lebanon, and he took up a new job heading up Hezbollah's activities targeting Israel from the Syrian Golan. One of the things that's most interesting about Unit 3800 is that the Iraqi Shia militants who were being trained, they didn't much like their Iranian trainers. The Iraqis are Arab and spoke Arabic. The Iranians are Persian and speak Farsi. And the Iranians kind of look down at these Iraqis who were fellow Shia and assume that they didn't know how to pray. They didn't know the basics of it. And they started them like at kindergarten level, talking down to them. There weren't enough Iranian trainers with really good Arabic. It was always annoying and so the Iranians figured out real quick, no, bring in Hezbollah from Lebanon. They're fellow Arabs. The Hezbollah trainers treated the Iraqis with much more respect. They were speaking Arabic. Some of the training was done in Iraq. Next levels were done in Iran. And there, people were spotted for their version of kind of, let's call it special forces training, or for unique, certain types of unique sniper or other types of capabilities. And for that, many of them were brought to Lebanon. And so Unit 3800 continues to operate at a much, 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 much smaller scale. And one of the most important things for Hezbollah in Iraq now is not training the Iraqi Shia militants, Saib al-Haq, Kataib Hezbollah, all of them are very, very capable now, thanks to Hezbollah. Hezbollah now, its biggest interest in Iraq, I would argue, is financial. And they have all kinds of companies and financial interests in Iraq. It's also a way to kind of try and evade U.S. sanctions when getting hold of U.S. dollars is difficult in Lebanon. It's difficult because of sanctions in Iran, but it's not necessarily easy, but it's less difficult in Iraq. And so that the financial bit has become much more important as the war in Iraq ended or slowed down.
Yeah, I mean, we all knew that these rat lines are being used from Iran into Iraq, taking EFPs in particular, keeping some of the people that can really build them or direct things in on the Iranian side of the border, just to keep them safe because they're more valuable, and then having those the knowledge and lower level people who are trained up to put EFPs together, go across those rat lines into Iraq, target U.S. forces there. With these EFPs that can defeat our armor, of course. Just we knew it's happening, but you couldn't do anything about it. You just have to fight your fight in Iraq. But as you know, that insurgencies or whatever is military operations and forces in a certain country often need a place where they can refit, where they can rest, where they can get funding, where they can be resupplied, and that's so Afghanistan. You have Pakistan. For Iraq, they have Iran and other countries as well. Go back to Vietnam and look at bordering countries back there. So it seems fairly. It's obviously not abnormal, but anyway, that's just a personal connection to Unit 3800.
But Jack, just one last thing on Unit 3800. There's also the kind of time continuum, right? Because it's not like things just start in Iraq. And in fact, it was Hezbollah that tested and perfected the IEDs, the roadside IEDs, especially those that were made to look exactly like whatever local rocks and stones were there, against the Israelis before the Israelis withdrew from southern Lebanon. And so they were really uniquely positioned to then train the Iraqis and how to use those as well. So it wasn't just the EFPs, which were a very unique and deadly capability, but also these kind of roadside IEDs that were kind of a Hezbollah signature.
Oh, yeah. And before I get up to today, what are some of the criminal enterprises? We talk about the obviously the terrorism, but criminal enterprises, credit cards, financial, some of the other things that Hezbollah is involved with outside what people typically think of as a Hezbollah type of operation. Can you talk a little bit about some of those criminal enterprises and some that touch the United States?
There are so many, Jack. It's amazing to me because this is a group that has really serious skills and has been very well trained by the Iranians. And yet they were among the terrorist groups most engaged in criminal activity, which from an operational standpoint is poor judgment. It's poor operational security. And it certainly was the case here in the United States. I saw it myself when I was in law enforcement and then the intelligence community, that so many times we'd stumble across a person or a network, not because of the counterterrorism investigations, but because they were breaking laws. And then you'd put it all together. An example where both sides were working this and kind of bumped into each other was called Operation Smokescreen in North Carolina. It was actually the first terrorism prosecution that I testified in as an expert after I left the FBI. And these were guys who, among other things, were basically buying up tons of cigarettes beyond what you're supposed to be, the number you're supposed to be able to buy. They weren't being super smart about it. It's not like, giving a bunch of people $100 saying, go buy the maximum, meet me in the parking lot or meet me back wherever it is. The guy was literally standing at the cash register. So the first person comes and, but he's not even paying for it. I'm paying for every last one of them. So the off-duty law enforcement officer who's hired to just as protection notices this, puts one together. And so from the law enforcement side, they're putting together a cross-border interstate shipping because they see these guys getting on the highway and going straight up north towards Michigan, right? Because in North Carolina is a very high tax on tobacco. And in Michigan, there's almost no tax on tobacco. And they would counterfeit the stamp and they'd make a significant amount of money. They even couldn't figure out, because they were telling people to drive fast because time's money. They couldn't figure out why they kept getting pulled over. So they said, it must be racial profiling because they were Arab Americans. So they paid a bunch of blonde white women to drive the trucks, but told them time's money, go. And then they couldn't figure out why law enforcement was profiling blonde white women who were also driving 95 miles an hour through multiple states. But the FBI at the same time was running an intelligence case. And there was this big meeting with a dun, dun, dun moment where FBI comes in and says, puts up slides, these guys, yeah, that's our cigarette smuggling guys. And then they hit enter and the words come across the bottom of the screen, Hezbollah cell. And they began to cooperate and do things together. Lots of cases like that here in the United States, lots abroad. Hezbollah is not in the business of producing narcotics in South America, but they've gotten the business of providing protection and especially laundering the proceeds of narcotic sales around the world. And so the U.S. and 7 other European countries got together for something called Operation Cedar. It led to multiple arrests, Mohammed Nuruddin and others in Paris. And they were taking the money, buying lots of expensive watches, flying them back to Lebanon. Money was going through a bank that Hezbollah was a partial owner of in the Gambia. It led to the shutting down of Lebanese Canadian Bank, a bank in Lebanon. There's lots and lots of examples like this. What's interesting is that later, once the Syrian civil war starts, we then see Hezbollah leveraging some of these same criminal networks, not to make money, but to procure certain types of weapons. And I ended up writing a whole big article about this for CTC Sentinel, published by West Point, because my question going in was, why would they do this? They get more weapons, all the weapons they need from Iran, right? And the answer was that when it came to small arms, Iran was basically providing knockoffs of knockoffs. So for your average, general person, whatever. But for Hezbollah special forces in particular, they wanted, they wanted an M4, they wanted AR-15, they wanted hollow points. They had specific things they wanted, and so they had some of these same networks get involved with people who were selling arms and use some of those same networks not to make money, but to get specific types of weapons for particular groups of fighters in Syria. So there's lots of opportunities, is the good news for law enforcement and intelligence, to collect a huge amount of information, to really understand and map out the networks, and where appropriate, to try and convict them. And I say where appropriate because if you follow these things closely, if you read my book closely, you'll see there are a bunch of big cases that I talk about, including one in the United States, where the person is publicly indicted and then nothing. You hear nothing. 2 of them I can think of in the United States. And that means, Jack, that these people are singing like canaries. And there's instead of being put on trial and jail, there's something else going on there. And that's great. But it means we're learning a lot.
It's so fascinating because you have a terrorist organization that is also a criminal enterprise, that is also a political party, give or take. So all these different kind of facets or verticals, supporting efforts to a main effort, and then you throw in proxy of Iran into all of that. It's such a fascinating organization, which is why it's so important to read this book, to read Hezbollah, so that people can really gain an understanding of what its capabilities are, and then to listen to conversations like this, to follow your current work on your podcast and the articles that you write, so you can understand what their current capabilities may be, what they're degraded to, and then what that leaves them, what options that leaves them today and in the future. But I want to get to that. Also, last few months, I think they've been in a military and intelligence masterclass by the IDF, by Mossad, by Israeli intelligence, culminating obviously in the airstrike that kills Nasrallah, leader of Hezbollah in Lebanon. But between October 7th and then October 8th, I believe, is when Hezbollah launches an attack against Israel. Not a full-fledged type of an attack, not a ground incursion or anything like that, which would have been interesting had that happened to coincide with October 7th. That would have been interesting. But between October 7th, 8th, and let's say mid-July, late July, what was your take on that time period? Did you anticipate what Israel would do? They would focus on Hamas in Gaza, and that there was maybe a threshold that they would continue to absorb from Hezbollah out of Lebanon, from Iran, even from other places where they're getting attacked. Was that your take? Did things play out the way that you anticipated, or were there surprises, let's say, between October 7th, 8th and mid-July this year?
Jack, so many surprises, and not just for me, but for people who are working this in government and for Hezbollah itself. So I'm going to break this answer down into October 7th, 8th through the 11th, and then what happened for about 11 and a half months. And then we'll get to more recently, including my last trip to Israel in July, when I went up to Metula, which is a closed military zone. It's the farthest north city in Israel, surrounded by Lebanon, 280 degrees, and by Hezbollah, 280 degrees. They let me up there with the whole big military escort, flak jacket, helmet, the whole thing. I kind of describe it as my Mike Dukakis moment. Remember when they put him in the tank because he didn't have, right? So I looked almost as foolish as he did.
Well, hopefully the aftermath of that isn't the same. Hopefully he never quite recovered from that.
Yeah. I'm just not showing people the picture.
There you go.
The point is, well, let's start at the beginning. So first off, and a part of this new chapter in the book is on Hezbollah's regional activities, and part of it is on Hezbollah in the lead up to October 7th. Hezbollah definitely knew about the Hamas plan. In fact, this was a Hezbollah plan. Hezbollah has been planning and putting in place, as we've seen now as the Israelis have gone into South Lebanon and digging tunnels and underground bunkers and forward deploying everything from uniforms and night vision goggles to every kind of weapon you can imagine for a cross-border raid that Hezbollah calls Operation Free the Galilee. And that's now being swept out and denied to them. But this has been a threat that the Israelis have been living under for years. I want to take even a bigger step back. Right? The last war with Hezbollah was 2006. And in the wake of that war, the Israeli government had a commission of inquiry led by a former judge, Judge Winograd, called the Winograd Commission. And it was pretty blunt and scathing, right? It found that there was poor policy direction, the goals were unarticulated, and that the Israelis hadn't done their intelligence homework going into this. Other things, too, that it was mostly an air war, etc. But policy direction, what are your goals? How's the military to interpret those? And did you do your homework? So what we've seen is that the Israelis have spent the past 18 years doing the homework. On October 7th, I don't think Hezbollah knew that October 7th was the day. They were clearly caught by surprise. And I think Hamas thought that they had an agreement from Hezbollah that whenever they woke up and surprised everybody and did it, Hezbollah would go in, but Hezbollah didn't. Because of the economic crisis in Lebanon, because though the Iranians have not become Zionists, they want the majority of the powder dry on the majority of the rockets, which are really, from Iran's perspective, more there to deter Israel from attacking Iran's nuclear program or as a second strike capability should someone attack the nuclear program than it is about destroying Israel in the moment. But had Hezbollah gone in on October 7th or 8th, it would have been a massacre. There were a total of 650 IDF soldiers across that entire border, and not all of them were combat. One senior Israeli official said to me, if Hezbollah had gone in, they would have stopped them in Haifa. I mean, that's, 40 miles or something? I mean, the numbers of dead and wounded and kidnapped would have dwarfed what we saw in the south. So while everybody is aware of what the Israelis did on October 7th, 8th, 9th, pushing soldiers down to the south, clearing out the remaining Hamas attackers, securing the border, all that. What most people don't know is there was just a convoy of helicopters going up north, just flinging people up there to protect that border. They felt like they dodged the bullet. On the 11th of October, 4 days after it all started, the Israeli War Cabinet met, and there was a debate. What should be done? This is before the Israelis went into Gaza. And several people, including the Minister of Defense, and at least some on the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Israel, said, before we invade Gaza, we need to deal with the threat from Hezbollah, because the threat from Hezbollah is a much more strategic threat. Hamas did something horrible, mostly because Israel failed. The Hamas attack should not have been able to be as devastating as it was. And the decision was not to do that. So fast forward, you have 11 and a half months of near daily cross-border shelling into Israel, but it's short range. It's not towards populated areas. It's mostly at military. And from the Israeli perspective, that's not okay, but it's livable in the moment. Like they feel like they've got it contained. There's a new set of rules that's going on, right? One Israeli said to me, up north, we see them burying their dead, not just people killed in the fight, but also just, people who die of old age, and we don't shoot at that. They see us burying our dead up north in the cemeteries. They don't shoot at us. And it was mostly Cornet, third generation Cornet anti-tank guided missiles, for which you need line of sight, but have an outer range of 10 kilometers, that were being used to target cars and homes, not only, but overwhelming majority. Which is how you got in the early stages before the Israeli invasion. There was this U.S.-led effort to negotiate a ceasefire. And under that ceasefire, the Israelis weren't even demanding that Hezbollah be deployed all the way to the Litani River, which was required under international law under UN Security Council Resolution 1701 that ended the war in 2006, but has never been implemented. Instead, they said 10 kilometers, which some people said, what's the random 10 kilometers? The answer is it's the outer range of the Cornet anti-tank guided missile. But what happened was that after 11 and a half months, Hezbollah failed to notice that things within Israeli society and government and military had changed. It's kind of like when you can't see your own kids getting taller because you see them every day, but then you see your niece or nephew you haven't seen in a while. You're like, oh my God, you're like 5 feet. That's what it was. Hezbollah was too close. They didn't see that the Israelis had it up to here. And the main thing was, and the only way that the Israeli war cabinet, just before the Israelis went north, changed their official war aims, was one change. And the change was not destroy Hezbollah. The change was not destroy as much of Hezbollah's rockets as possible, or even clear the south of Hezbollah weapons. It was enable the almost 70,000 Israeli civilians who've been displaced from their homes in the north for almost a year at that point to be able to go home. Now, in the moment, my thought was it brought me back to Winograd 2006. That's a very vague war goal. You're leaving the IDF, you're leaving the military to interpret what do I need to do to achieve that? But it wasn't as big a gap as in 2006, and this time the Israelis had done their homework. So I was very concerned that if the Israelis went north, Hezbollah would start firing 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 rockets of different types a day at Israel, which would have overwhelmed even Israel's 4-tier air defense system. And you would have seen significant civilian casualties. You would have seen significant critical infrastructure damage, water desalination plants, the energy infrastructure, hospitals. And the Israelis, their home front was preparing for that. They started moving or building additional ICUs, intensive care units, in Rambam Hospital in Haifa in the north, in the sub-basement car garage, anticipating that there would be shelling of the hospital. But the Israelis knew something that the rest of us didn't because of the homework that they'd done, which is that there was a way to hit Hezbollah in very quick succession and stages that would amount to a series of body blows, and you hit them again before they can recover, before they can act. It's like a boxing match. That would enable Israel to be able to take the fight to Hezbollah such that Hezbollah would not be able to use its two strategic tools, the rockets, especially the medium and long range rockets, and what we call the precision guided munitions that you don't shoot towards a town or even a neighborhood or a block or a building, but a window. And second, the cross-border raid capability in the south. So this started with something that was not a cyber attack. It was described as a cyber attack in a lot of press, the pager attack. It was the opposite. It was old school tradecraft, getting into Hezbollah's supply chain, setting up a front company, and putting something, so basically it seems to have been some type of liquid explosive, so that when Hezbollah did its checks of these devices, they wouldn't see that there was something in there. And blowing up the pagers that were specifically going to people who were war fighters. The original plan was to blow them up in the event of war only, but apparently Hezbollah seemed to figure out something was going on, and the Israelis said, now or never, under the circumstances, go now. Everybody's freaking out because 2,000, 2,500 more people get wounded. Apparently, there's an error message, and you had to, with 2 fingers, clear the error message. So injuries to the eyes, injuries to the hands. In other words, the kind of injuries that take someone off the battlefield, probably permanently, but certainly in the moment, and not just anybody. These are people, it was probably a status symbol to have one of these pagers. And then before they could react at all, walkie-talkies go off the next day. Now you're in Hezbollah. You have no idea what gear you can rely on. Right. And so when Hezbollah decides, no, now we have to send Israel a message and we have to do a cross-border raid, and they have Ibrahim Akil, who's one of the people behind the early bombings in the 1980s that you and your co-author wrote about in Beirut, targeting Beirut, he gets together in person in a Hezbollah bunker in the basement of a building in downtown Beirut, thinking, well, we can't get on our devices. We've got to meet in person, but surely no one's going to hit us here. And before they can finish that sentence, they're all taken out. 15 to 20 Radwan Special Forces commanders and Ibrahim Akil, who, by the way, like there are people in CIA who are doing a jig over Fuad Shukr, Ibrahim Akil, these guys being killed because these are the people who took out our CIA station and the Marine barracks, and you know it very, very well. So, and then, of course, it doesn't end there. They're taking out infrastructure. They're taking out Nasrallah himself. They're taking out Nasrallah's successor. They're taking out Mohammed Qasir, the guy who oversees the movement of weapons from Iran. And as soon as he's taken out, about 2 weeks later, his successor's taken out. And they keep doing that. So it's not just tier 1 or tier 2. It's multiple tiers down. They're not just gunning for anybody. They're gunning for specific people. They're destroying Hezbollah infrastructure in Beirut, in the south, in Tyre, and elsewhere. I've seen this frequently referred to as decapitation. No. Decapitation would have been taken out Nasrallah, maybe taken out a few other people. This is open heart surgery with no intention of having an organ transplant. Like Hezbollah does not exist. Now, in time, if we let it to, and it would take time, maybe they could resurrect themselves. They're still capable. They're still dangerous, but nowhere near as dangerous as they were. The big thing moving forward is, I think the Israelis will have succeeded in removing biggest parts of the strategic threats Hezbollah posed to them. But now lots of people are wondering, well, you know, the Lebanese kept saying, we can't take on Hezbollah. They're too strong. Someone else has to do it. No one was going to do it. Now the Israelis at least partially did it. Could Lebanon assert sovereignty over the rest of the country? Could they establish a monopoly over the use of force? Could Hezbollah be forced to be just a political party? And I would love to see this happen. But I fear it will be a bridge too far, because what the Israelis will not end up doing, I certainly hope, is a deeper invasion. I hope they achieve what they want to achieve, and then they move out, and there's a plan to put something else in. But they're not going to take out every AK-47. They're not going to take out every Hezbollah fighter. There are going to be thousands of Hezbollah fighters with arms. And if you think they won't try and defend their position in Lebanon, I think you got another thing coming. So what can be expected is a new reality on the Lebanese-Israeli border that should have happened in 2006 under UN Security Council Resolution 1701 that was just never enforced, with an understanding that, like it or not, if someone else doesn't enforce it, the Israelis are gonna now. Like, they're done living under this type of a threat. And whether something better can happen in Lebanon, I would love for that to happen, but that's going to be something for the Lebanese to decide.
I mean, it's been quite remarkable to watch all this happen. I have a few other questions, but before I get there, so you took us up to late September here, and we saw video of Israeli forces preparing to go into Lebanon. What is the status of that? What was described as a limited incursion? Because we're not seeing too much about that on through legacy media anyway. Obviously, we've been preoccupied with an election here, but we haven't really seen too much in our press, and I haven't seen that much really coming out of press in the Middle East or even or Europe. But what's the status of that limited incursion that was gearing up and was taking place in late September, early October?
So the Israelis are really trying to explain that what they're doing is that they're trying to do something much more limited and targeted. In the real world, as you know well, even a limited and targeted military campaign is going to have lots of unintended casualties, especially when in Lebanon, as Hamas did in Gaza, they literally are building military infrastructure behind and under civilian locations. And so the Israelis will say, you know, you should get out of this area of the Bekaa Valley now, you should get out of this area of Beirut. It can be difficult for civilians to do that. And so it's never as limited and targeted as you'd like it to be. But the reality is, I blame Hezbollah for doing all of the fighting behind human shields, for building all of this non-state actor threat against a neighbor within and under and behind all of this infrastructure. The Israelis are still carrying out air campaign and a ground campaign on a daily basis. And just over this weekend, for example, two really significant Hezbollah operatives apparently were targeted. One we mentioned earlier, Ali Musa Dakduka Musawi, who was already proven but really cut his teeth and became a really important person in Iraq with Hezbollah's Unit 3800, where he was arrested first by British SAS special forces and then handed over to the US and eventually the Iraqis, and they let him go. And then the other is Salim Ayash, who actually is a senior Hezbollah operative who was a U.S. passport holder and was indicted and convicted by the Special Tribunal for Lebanon in The Hague, the UN tribunal investigating the assassination of former Lebanese Prime Minister Rafi Hariri in a huge car bomb on the Corniche in Beirut. He's been wanted for a long time, and apparently he was also killed. So there's a lot going on. It's not just happening in the south. That's what the land incursion is, but they are targeting Hezbollah infrastructure in Beirut, in the Bekaa Valley. They're targeting the rat lines you talked about along the Syrian-Lebanese border. And meanwhile, they are playing defense. And so you have drones and other things being shot at Israel from Iraq by these Iraqi Shia militants we've been discussing, by the Houthis in Yemen. Every once in a while, you still have stuff from Gaza. There's a lot of daily activity going on against terrorist operatives in the West Bank. Israelis described fighting a 7-front war. And of course, the 7th front is Iran. For the first time in April, and then more recently, Iran fired, in the first instance, ballistic missiles, low-altitude cruise missiles, and drones at Israel. In the more recent attack, it was all ballistic missiles. Together with U.S. Central Command in particular, but also some others, we have collectively, the United States and Israel, been done really their unthinkable and providing kind of air defense no one thought possible. I describe this as the single greatest commercial for others in the region, Gulf allies in particular, not only about the fact that Iran is such a threat to the region, but what participating in a regional air defense can do for you. Mm-hmm. And the Israelis retaliated against Iran a couple weeks ago now. And so now the big question is, does Iran respond back? At first, they were pretty quiet. And then it took a couple of days, it appears, before the supreme leader of Iran really got the briefing of just how badly they were hit, including, it appears, basically taking out their radar capability. They're blind. And so they went then from very kind of yelling that they're going to hit back hard, and now they've been walking that back, probably because they've understood how exposed they are. If they attack Israel now and Israel responds again, it would be not so good for Iran. So I'm hopeful that that piece of it will quiet down, but I fear that we're at the cusp of the new normal, and that is a war where Israel is not just fighting Iran's proxies, this terrorist group and that terrorist group, but also Iran directly. And as much as the United States wants to pivot from the Middle East to Asia, and as much as President-elect Trump has said that he wants to end wars, I think that U.S. interests are still so significant in the region that there's a lot more that's going to have to be done to stabilize the region and push back on this new normal Iran is trying to create, this ring of fire around Israel, this uniting of the fronts where Iran and all of its proxies can do things. And it wouldn't be just against Israel. The Gulf states are concerned as well.
I start from the outside looking in. I noticed a change in the Israeli strategy to really leverage all aspects of their military and intelligence apparatus. Really late July. I've been watching as much as I can, juggling everything I have going on with the books and everything else. But I've been keeping an eye on what's going on over there, and I've been just wondering when. When are they going to do this? When are they going to leverage some of the assets they may have in place, some of the capabilities they may have in place? And then I started seeing it late July. We started to see an uptick in these targeted assassinations. One of someone who was involved in Beirut 1983. All those years later, unbelievable. Israel does it for us with all of our military and intelligence might. So I see that there was an incursion by Israeli special operations, and I'm wondering what you can tell me about it, into Syria that really got no press over here. But it was fascinating in that they go in. Well, first there's two air bombardments, so targets softened up. Okay, now we have Israeli special operations going into Syria. They go in. They use drones, from what I understand, as a blocking force, which I hadn't seen before. So for those listening, usually in the United States, we'd use Rangers or so, or a force as a blocking force to keep people from coming in. You can also use it as a containment force. You want to keep people from getting out. While another, maybe usually a smaller unit, goes in to do a specific operation in a building or a compound or something along those lines. But from what I read, they go in. Now you have Israeli Special Operations Forces on the ground. They're going into a Hezbollah precision-guided munitions facility in Syria, and they have to go underground. They have to go in to make sure it's destroy it from the inside out. And then also the added benefit of being able to gather intelligence at the same time, rather than just destroying everything with a missile hit, if you could get down that deep. So my understanding is they go in, they're using drones as a blocking force, which is fascinating. They go in, they exploit for intelligence, they destroy this facility. They hit a couple other facilities also. I think one's a Russian listening post. And they managed to get, the reporting I saw said 2 to 4 Iranian scientists who are working, or maybe engineers, the article I read said scientists, but someone working in this precision-guided munition facility, and they take them back to Israel. So, and it got barely any press, but the distance, the use of drones, it was just fascinating to me. What do you know about that operation from this past summer?
Look, you just covered everything that's been reported publicly, which is not a lot. And I think from the Israeli perspective, that's fine, right? There's certain things they want people to know. In a case like this, I think what they want people to know is that it happened, and that what their reach is, what their intelligence capabilities are, the use of a combination of unique tactics is also something noteworthy. They've done things like that deeper into Syrian territory. They did something more recently, less deep into Syrian territory, where Hezbollah had a warehouse of precision-guided munitions, reportedly. The Israelis are going pretty far. And I think one of the things that we're going to be watching for next is, there was some talk that Iran wouldn't respond to Israel directly this time, but maybe it would have Iraqi Shia militias respond from Iraq. And then the Iraqis came out and said, no, we won't let that. We won't tolerate that. Iran, don't make us a target. But it's something everybody's watching very closely. I think if the Iranians think that if the Israelis are shot at by Iranian munitions fired by Iraqi Shia militias beholden to Iran from Iraq, if they think that the Israelis won't respond to Iran, they got another thing coming. In the past, that definitely would have been the case. Frankly, it's how we've responded, right? When Iranian proxies have targeted U.S. forces in Iraq, we've just responded against the Iraqi proxies. I think the Israelis are at a point where they would do something differently, and the operations that you just described in Syria kind of point to the fact that they have long-range capabilities. Obviously, they flew all the way to Iran to carry out the bombings there. They cleared an air corridor, took out some radar capabilities along the way. They clearly have the capability to do that. One of the concerns is that if Iran decided to do this, it would open things up for them to use shorter range rockets, because if they could get someone to fire rockets at Israel from Western Iraq, they don't have to go anywhere near as far, right? Just basically fly over Jordan and you're there. I don't see the Israelis not responding to this type of activity, probably both in Iraq targeting those that launched them, and in Iran to those who asked for the operation to happen. And the incidents you're talking about in Syria, I think, are Israel saying, this is our new normal. We hear your new normal. We're upping you our new normal. We're not willing to allow you to target our citizens like this anymore. Which is why I think that even if, please God, there's an end to the conflict in Gaza and some type of governance that can have stability there and provide for Palestinians and provide a situation that's secure for Israelis and an opportunity to rebuild, even if there's an end to the fighting in Lebanon that can do the same and provide a more secure border area for Israel and stability for Lebanese and independence from the government within that Hezbollah had created. If all those things were to happen, and I hope they do, we're still going to find ourselves, I think, looking at kind of a 10-year period of tension with Iran, and by extension, its proxies. And the first big hurdle, I think, that the new administration is going to find after inauguration is Iran, and the nuclear program in particular. And so this will be the first, or one of the first, tests of the administration. President Trump at one point during the campaign said, I don't want war with Iran. I'm going to negotiate the best deal ever. I think that's going to be a pretty heavy lift. I don't see that happening. He said he wants to end wars. Unfortunately, our adversaries get a vote. So we'll see what happens. But I think that this is space to watch.
Yeah, I seem to see that when I talk about mid-July, late July, and everything that happened since between Israel and Hezbollah in particular, but also Iran, Syria, proxy forces. It seems like this was a shift in the paradigm, a shift in the model where the rules were essentially set by Iran through proxies in Lebanon in the early 80s when you talk about the geopolitics of it and the relationship of Iran to the U.S. and to a lesser extent Israel, because I think there have been different tipping points and different kind of outlier scenarios with Israel over the years where those rules have been shattered but then put back in place essentially. And it seems like now, with everything that Israel has done in fairly quick succession from mid to late July up to now, seems to indicate a shift in those rules that really Iran got to put in place in the early 80s through these proxies. We'll see what plays out, but that's what it seems like from the outside looking in. After that Israeli special operations strike that I mentioned earlier, we have, was it Operation Northern Arrows, and this degradation of Hezbollah rocket and missile capability out of Lebanon. How much of that capability was taken out? I think I read reports that said about maybe half. Regardless, there's a lot of their capability was degraded at any point during those operations. What do the rocket and missile capabilities look like today, and what can you tell me about Operation Northern Arrows?
So we don't know a whole lot of detail about what percentage of the rockets were hit and what's left. The Defense Minister Gallant, who just was replaced as defense minister in Israel, but before he left, he gave an interview to Israeli media saying 80% of Hezbollah's rockets have been destroyed. I spoke to some people who said it's more than 50, probably a lot more than 50, but probably not 80. I've heard everything from 60 to 80. I don't think the people who are giving those numbers really know, but it's a lot. And you can, if you follow these attacks and you watch the videos, the series of explosions indicate that there's a lot of munitions that are being destroyed. I think the most telling thing here is that, Iran in this last Israeli attack basically had most of its radar system knocked out. Purportedly also a piece of the supply chain for their ballistic missiles. So it might be more difficult for them to replace the ballistic missiles that they shoot. And now they also don't have a significant portion of the Hezbollah arsenal that they relied upon. Reportedly, most of what's been hit has been the longer range stuff that is the bigger threat to Israel. And it makes sense that that's what Israel would target if it had the intelligence. And it seems that they did. But Hezbollah, even if 80% of 150,000 to 200,000 rockets are destroyed, that still leaves them with thousands of rockets. And the shorter range stuff, they are sure to have plenty of as well. Now, the Israelis have been sweeping up a lot of that in the south, but frankly, that just suggests to me how many weapons systems they had of these shorter range types, rather than suggesting that they've destroyed or confiscated the majority. We just don't know. But I think it is safe to assume that the kind of strategic threat that Hezbollah posed to Israel between these two capabilities, medium long range precision guided missiles and rockets, A, and B, the cross border raid capability, with all kinds of infrastructure, underground tunnels, etc. These have been largely now beyond degraded, really, really decimated. And that's going to put Hezbollah into a whole new situation, not even counting the fact that its leadership is gone. The people who are in senior leadership positions today were backbenchers yesterday. There are very few really seasoned leaders left. And even at the top, Naim Qassem, as I said, was not the man they wanted to be leading this organization. And my understanding is that there are some Quds Force generals and colonels who've been sent to Lebanon who are actually leading the organization in the moment.
Yeah. Do you think that this is a shift in what, and correct me if I'm wrong, that for a long time it seemed like there was an acceptable level of violence on both sides that was tolerated, both in the South and in the North. And as long as one of those sides didn't exceed that by too much, didn't cross one of these lines, that it wouldn't lead to a larger regional war or a retaliation that would really have a have a noticeable impact on that organization, Hezbollah or Hamas or another proxy force. Do you see that? Do you see Israel, Hezbollah, Iran returning to that state after everything that has happened over the last now over a year? Do you think things return to this model where there's an acceptable level of violence on both sides, or has that paradigm shifted so radically that that's not going to be what the future holds?
So I think it shifted. And I think it wasn't the case leading up to the war either. Like before October 7th, Hezbollah started shooting rockets. The Israelis responded. And Hezbollah only shot rockets under certain circumstances. It got to the point where Hezbollah didn't respond at all when the Israelis would take out delivery of weapon systems coming to Hezbollah from Iran, unless the Israelis did something, struck something in Lebanon, or a Hezbollah operative was killed or injured. Otherwise, the Israelis basically had free reign and Hezbollah wouldn't do anything. Then October 7th happens and you have near daily shelling by Hezbollah at Israel. And you then had this new rules of the game, which very much were what you were saying. And as long as it didn't go too far, it could basically be tolerated in the moment. There are a few instances where the Israelis did something and it didn't go as planned and they hit something they didn't want to. The same with Hezbollah. Hezbollah shot a rocket that was intended to hit a military base that was fairly close to a civilian hospital. It completely missed and landed in the parking lot of the hospital. Had it gone a little bit further and hit the civilian hospital, all bets would have been off. But again, what Hezbollah didn't understand was that the drip, drip, drip of daily attacks, the inability to send people home, the fact that Hezbollah had successfully depopulated a sliver of the Israeli north, only 2 to 4 kilometers from the border, but still, at a certain point, the Israelis just couldn't tolerate that anymore because there was this really serious diplomatic effort led by U.S. diplomat Amos Hochstein that the Israelis said, we're in, we support it, and we realize we'll have to give in on some of the border issues, etc. But and they kept saying it publicly. This wasn't secret. They kept saying, if this doesn't succeed at a certain point, we're going to have to redeploy Hezbollah from the border ourselves in our own way. Like if Hezbollah had agreed to this deal and deployed 10 kilometers from the border, Nasrallah would still be alive. They'd still have all their stuff along the border. None of their rockets would have been hit. None of their headquarters would have been destroyed. It was a severe miscalculation. Nasrallah, who was long seen as the Israel whisperer, not only for his own group Hezbollah, but for the Iranians, the guy who really had his finger on the pulse, he made a pretty big miscalculation. And at the end of the day, the diplomatic process didn't go anywhere. And the Israelis said, that's it. We got to do it ourselves. They had put all kinds of things in place. They were sitting on this intel, sitting on these capabilities, sitting. And eventually, well, we saw what happened. It was wild for me because you're so right that the turning point was mid to late July. I was there in early July. And my takeaway when I came back was twofold. I wrote a piece in the LA Times right after I got back saying that if there is a war contrary to conventional wisdom, the biggest factor won't be the rockets per se, but will be the fact that the Israeli civilians can't go back to their homes. And the main reason they won't go back to their homes isn't even so much the daily rocket fire, it's their fear of a cross-border raid. The fear of the cross-border raid, not the rockets, is probably what's going to be the big. And unfortunately, I was right. The second takeaway was that in the moment when I was there, it still seemed like the majority of the policymakers, the decision makers, and the military were falling on the side of don't risk full-scale war with Hezbollah. And it changed, like starting the week after I left. I remember speaking to people there and saying, this was my real takeaway, and people telling me, you were right a week ago. But it's changed now, and people, the society is moving, and decision makers are following them, and the military's wanted to do this for a while, to take, saying, look, if October 7th taught us anything, it's that we can't allow adversaries sworn to our destruction to be able to accumulate fighters and weapons and training. Because you know what? They're not collecting these as paperweights. Someday they're going to try and use it against us. We didn't believe it possible in Gaza. We were wrong. We thought we had them deterred. We thought we had bought calm with Qatari money. You know what? They're the ones. Hamas is the one that pulled the big intelligence coup against Israel. And the Israelis are saying, not going to happen again. And it was a little weird for me, just having just been there. And the takeaway was so clear, but the change just happened felt like the day after I flew out, the change started happening, but the change came.
Yeah. And so we're talking models and paradigms. This is a semi-shift of gears, but maybe not holistically. But when we talk about hostages and we talk about Hamas still having hostages, and you have essentially a precedent in place from the 2011 Shalit deal where you get 1,000 for one. Essentially, one Israeli soldier, which in one sense says, hey, we value our people and our soldiers so much that we're willing to give up 1,000 prisoners, terrorists, Sinwar being one of them, and other people as well, who end up being the lead planners of October 7th. But now that seems to be shifting, or, as horrible as it is to say, it might be necessary to shift that, to send a message to not just Hamas, but other terrorist organizations in the region who are thinking of grabbing either Israeli soldiers or citizens in exchange for 1,000 hostages. That might not be, or not 1,000 prisoners, because maybe that might not be what happens in the future. When you think about hostages and exchanges and deals, how do you frame it now with everything that we've learned over the past few years?
So I think we've got to think about this like in the moment, where there are still hostages held, and then think about it when the dust settles and for like the next time around. Because I think there's a difference, but at the end of the day, I don't think there will be a difference in approach. Israel is a tiny country, right? 10 million people. And almost everybody serves, and everybody knows somebody. Right? I mean, this country is traumatized because between the hostages and those who were killed and wounded, and those soldiers, including the overwhelming majority who are reservists, they're 38-year-old accountants who are now fighting. Everybody knows multiple somebodies who have been killed or injured, and so in an Israeli society where basically everybody serves, like the government has to be able to say, "We'll do everything possible to get your kid, your dad, whatever, back if this happens." In the moment, the main reason there hasn't been a second round, because there was back in November a year ago, the reason there hasn't been another round, it's true that President Netanyahu, Bibi Netanyahu, has played hardball, but in my conversations with officials here, it's very, very clear, and it's very clear to them, that the single bottom line reason there hasn't been another round is because Hamas moved the goalposts. They want more people and more senior people, more people with blood on their hands to be released in the first round, and they don't want to release more people, or what for Hamas, the more sensitive people, meaning Israeli soldiers, because they want more people released for soldiers. They don't want to give more. It seems that maybe Hamas is feeling that maybe there would be a first round, but not a second round. And that completely put a stall to things. It's then also true that the Israelis carried out this strike in Iran, assassinating Ismail Haniyeh, the overall head of Hamas. Then they killed Yahya Sinwar in Gaza. That's also true. It's not like the negotiations couldn't continue with the other leaders that remain. It's not like, as much as that disrupted negotiations, it also created a little bit of leverage for negotiations, because Hamas is even more on the ropes. The other problem right now is time. It is believed that a significant number, it's obviously very painful to say, but a significant number of the hostages are likely no longer with us, and that for those who are still alive, deeply traumatized, time has not been, but certainly now is not on their side. And so that creates a situation where the Israelis would probably be more willing to release people in the moment, to get back people while they can. And I think in the moment, you'd probably get Israeli security military types saying, look, in the moment, like, all we're doing all day when necessary is targeting the bad guys. If I got to release somebody and then target them tomorrow, if they're going to do things, like, that's what I got to do. Like, they don't have the luxury of sitting back like you and I are right now talking about this in a theoretical way. This is extremely tangible for them, and probably the people who are being asked to make these decisions are people who know people who've been lost, etc.
Yeah. Now back to Hezbollah here in our final few moments here. What is different about Hezbollah today over a month and a half ago, 2 months ago? Is it a different organization? Have their capabilities been degraded? If so, to what extent? Could they still mount a cross-border operation, kind of like an October 7th, but from the north? What does Hezbollah look like today?
Hezbollah is a fraction of itself today. It's still dangerous. It still has capabilities, mostly in terms of being able to fire rockets. And it's done this from time to time, including firing rockets even at Tel Aviv a few times. It still has a small number of those capabilities. You never say never. And so it's possible that maybe an operative or a small cell of operatives could somehow penetrate the border, but probably not to the extent of an October 7th. The Israeli military presence along the northern border is the exact opposite of what it was on October 7th and 8th. There's a tremendous capability there now. They've got huge intelligence focus there now. And it's a completely different situation. So you've kind of cornered a tiger. You're poking the tiger. You poked it pretty hard. They're going to try and lash out as they can. Frankly, my biggest concern in the moment isn't cross-border raids. It's not rockets, which will continue in fits and starts. It's where we started our conversation. It's Unit 910. It's the Islamic Jihad Organization, External Security Organization. When I look at those leaders, that's the one unit where I haven't seen any of the top. There's basically 4 or 5 people in Lebanon. I haven't seen any of them killed yet. They don't need big infrastructure to do this, right? You can sit in an apartment, you can sit in a dusty basement. They just need to be able to communicate in code to operatives they do have abroad, and to get them to try and carry something out. I remind Ali Kourani, the guy who was convicted here in the United States, when asked under what circumstance do you think that you might be asked to carry out an attack based on the surveillance you've done, he's the one who referred to himself as a sleeper cell. He said, well, if Nasrallah was killed, check that box. If the U.S. was perceived to be involved in a war directly with Iran, I think you can check that box. Mm-hmm. And if you're Hezbollah and you want to respond to all the things the Israelis have done to you, and they definitely want to respond, how do you do that? The only thing left to you is international terrorist attacks. So I can tell you the Israelis are very, very, very focused on preventing this type of thing. But as you well know, as do I from my time in counterterrorism, there's no such thing as 100% success. We got to get it right every time, and they got to get it right once.
Yeah. And what does this say? We've been talking a lot about Hezbollah's capabilities, but what do the past few months tell you about Israel's capabilities? And was anything a surprise to you?
Look, there were so many surprises. They did a lot of things that come out of a bad Hollywood script, cheap paperback novel. No one would believe it. And there's a lot to be impressed with. It's also the case that they've made mistakes. They would tell you they were put in a position where they had to strike back so forcefully that there were this kind of casualties. But Israelis, and to be perfectly blunt, Jews around the world who are not Israelis are being, put in a position to defend against what some people think is genocide. I don't think it is. I think it's terrible, but I don't see this as a genocide. And there's going to be a very long tail to that. It also is creating a situation where the Israelis need to take a hard look at their supply chain. It's very reliant on the United States. They're shooting down cheap drones with expensive interceptors. Their Jericho's anti-ballistic missile system has been tested and proven in this conflict, which is great, but these are not inexpensive systems. The Israelis are constantly having to look at their inventory and what's there. There was a contentious vote in Congress at one point about whether or not to re-up U.S. funding for Israel's defensive air defense systems. And there were a lot of people who voted against it. And had they succeeded, we would have seen many, many, many more dead civilians at the hands of Iran and a variety of regional terrorist groups. And so I think it's important to continue to support those and find ways to bring this to a close, and then work much, much harder than we ever did to do two things. One, implement 1701, UN Security Council Resolution 1701, in ways it was never implemented before. 1701 says Hezbollah is not supposed to be deployed at all south of the Litani River, and Hezbollah is not supposed to be rearmed at all. It was rearmed many times over, and stuff that went down in the south was many times over. Got to work really hard on that. The second thing is, more holistically, we have to do a lot more to prevent Iran from being able to rearm and refund its proxies like it has over the past, more than, but especially the past 2 decades. This is the Houthis. This is Shia militias in Iraq, which will be especially hard given the shared border. This is Hezbollah. This is Hamas. You like the way it was done. You don't like the way it was done. The reality is the Israelis have now significantly degraded Hamas in Gaza and Hezbollah in Lebanon. Whether you like the way it happened or not, we should take advantage at least of the good here, which is that really, really bad terrorist groups are a fraction of themselves, and we should make sure that they can't be rebuilt, because we see the consequence. We see the consequence to civilians. We collectively allowed these groups to build up military capabilities within civilian neighborhoods, within civilian apartment buildings. We cannot allow that to happen again. Or, having read this book, we will later find ourselves watching the movie, and it will be no better the next time. So now we have to do what we can to make sure that entities like this can't present that kind of a threat again.
And what do you think the U.S. has learned from Israel's actions, specifically from mid-July through late September, early October? They took out 2 people responsible for killing Americans in 1983, 40 plus years later, with all of the U.S.'s military, economic, intelligence might. It took this happening. It took Israel, a country the size of Israel, to go and get these guys. They lived for over 40 years after that attack. What has the United States learned over the past few months by watching Israel?
Look, tactics aside, that's an obvious thing. I think the main thing is, everybody said that if you end up doing something directly against Iran, if you try to do something directly against Hezbollah, you'll see World War III, right? It can't be done. So, what was the biggest thing we did? Taking out Qasem Soleimani, the late general who headed the Quds Force. But it's a one-off. We do one-offs, right? The lesson here is that if you plan properly and you have a really granular understanding of your adversary, and you are willing to do the body blows, you can make a difference. And it's not that the U.S. didn't have the capabilities, Jack, to go after these individuals who carried out the bombings against our embassy and our Marines in the 1980s. It's that the policy decision was not to do it. Look, you write about it in the book right afterwards. At one point, we and the French were going to carry out a joint air raid, right? And in the end, we backed out. The French did something on their own, and my understanding is purposefully shot a little bit to the left because they didn't want to bear the consequences solo, but they wanted to be shown to have done something, which was nothing. It was a policy decision. We had the capabilities, but we were wary of using them. Right? We did do something. Remember, in 2008, it's now public that it was a U.S.-Israeli joint operation that took out the founder of Hezbollah's Islamic Jihad organization, Mughniyeh. But again, single, one-off, nothing since. And the answer as to why did small Israel do this is because, we live an ocean apart and they live right there. But even the Israelis didn't want to do this, didn't want to do this, didn't want to do it. And by this, I mean what happened in Gaza and what happened in Lebanon both. The Israelis did not like Hamas, but they were willing to buy the calm so long as they felt that even if Hamas got stronger in Gaza, they were deterred, they were distracted, they prioritized their governance project in Gaza. All of that turned out to be wrong. But the Israelis allowed themselves to believe it because they didn't want to go in on the ground in Gaza. Same in Lebanon, but only after 11 and a half months of nonstop rocket fire and real concern that Hezbollah was going to use the cross-border raid capabilities, and Hezbollah's refusal to agree to anything under the diplomatic efforts led by the U.S., but including the French and the Germans and others, that they eventually said, look, we don't want to, but we have to. We can't. How many years are we supposed to let this go on? And so I think there's the beginning of an understanding that we can't let really, really bad, dangerous actors continue to sit there and build up capabilities, fooling ourselves into thinking surely they'll never act on it. And so while I am sensitive to the idea that we can't be the world's policeman and that we have strategic interests with great power competition in Asia, and that we have real issues with Russia, the Middle East isn't going away, and actors there get a vote. And so I think we're going to have to come up with policies that in a balanced fashion maintain our interests there. For example, I point to the U.S. deployment in Syria. You got about 900 soldiers there. Very, very inexpensive financially, very, very inexpensive in terms of risk to life. We've lost very few people there. It is a extremely affordable, low-risk operation with huge dividends vis-a-vis ISIS and vis-a-vis Iran. And so I certainly hope that the new administration doesn't shoot itself in the foot by saying, no, we're out of everything, even out of Syria. My hope.
And in the couple minutes we have left here, new Israeli Defense Minister Gallant was fired. I think that Netanyahu tried to get rid of him earlier on, didn't work out politically, but ends up doing it on a very interesting date, November 5th, right at the height of the U.S. election, and everyone focused on what's going on here. And Gallant, correct me if I'm wrong, also was very aggressive. I don't know who has taken his place and what that person's background is, but what can you tell me about the firing of Gallant last week?
Look, the concern among many in Israel is that Yaakov Katz, the new defense minister, was the foreign minister before, is not someone with military background. Gallant was a military person and quite experienced. There was a lot of domestic politics here having nothing to do with security, with Gaza, or with Lebanon. There is a domestic issue as to whether or not ultra-Orthodox members of Israeli society should be required, or some should be required to serve in the military like the rest of society. And after over a year of war, parents of kids who are required to serve in the military under what is now very dangerous conditions are wondering, why does my son or daughter have to go and theirs don't? And Gallant felt strongly that the ultra-Orthodox, or at least some of the ultra-Orthodox, should be required to serve. That was a problem for Netanyahu's political coalition. And I think that had a lot to do with this too. So at the end of the day, whoever the defense minister is working with an extremely experienced chief of staff and command chiefs. and intelligence services. They're not going to be running blind. And Minister Katz is not new to government. He was the foreign minister. He's very familiar with the issues that are going on. I think this had more to do with domestic politics, however, than it did with anything about the war or how the war was being prosecuted.
Yeah. And so I know, real quick, I know we got to let you go. So the last Israeli strike into Iran did not target their uranium enrichment facilities, any suspected nuclear facilities where they're doing maybe nuclear modeling on weapons. It stayed away from those, it seems, intentionally. Same thing with some of the larger ports, the larger oil production facilities. Is that next? As things move, are they moving up a ladder as far as escalation goes? Are those the next? Because a lot of people thought they were going to hit them a few weeks ago, and they didn't. It seems they stayed away from those intentionally.
Yeah.
Was that the right move? And two, is that the next move?
So the Biden administration and many in Europe really kind of pressed Israel, saying, look, of course, you need to respond to what the ballistic missile attack that Iran did. But let's try and do this in such a way that sends a message, but enables for an opportunity to de-escalate. And if you hit the nuclear program, that'll be escalatory. And if you hit the oil industry, it could affect the oil industry and, jump in the price of oil. And the Iranians came out very, very publicly and said, if you hit our oil industry, we will respond not only against you, but against the oil industries in Saudi, in the UAE, and in Kuwait. So the Israelis did something that I thought was really smart. I thought both of their series of responses have been very, very smart. The first time around in April, they responded and hit things right next to a nuclear facility, including getting past the Russian air defense systems. So anybody who thought they couldn't go the distance now knew better. Anybody who thought they couldn't get past these Russian air defense systems now knew better. Anybody who thought they didn't know where or if they could hit the nuclear facilities that are known, they knew better. The reality is that Iran's nuclear facilities are very, very diffuse. They're spread out in many places. There's redundancy, and some of the most significant are buried very, 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 very deep underground in our mountains. And Iran produces, because of earthquakes, some very, very, very strong cement. And it's not clear if the Israelis could really destroy that. You'd really need to hit with a big bomb, hit exactly again the same spot with a big bomb, probably several times. The second time, they took out Russian and Iranian air defense systems, right? So not only did they evade, they took them out, right? So my understanding is that the Iranians are basically blind right now, right? So they can strike back, but the Israelis will be able to do whatever the hell they want. And so I think the message this time around is pretty clear that Iran, if you escalate by striking us again, we will escalate by hitting something more. The new defense minister that you've been mentioning, he has made a couple of statements, as have several other Israeli political figures, suggesting that now's the time to remove the big strategic threat that Iran poses to Israel, its nuclear capability. Now, whether or not they can do that in a series of strikes or whether they just delay it, I'm not a nuclear expert, nor am I a military expert, but it is clear to me it's not something you can do in a couple of waves with a few sorties. And so it remains to be seen. And if in the event that Iran doesn't respond to Israel's response to Iran's attack, then the Israelis, I think, don't initiate another attack in the moment, all of which is speculation, and we will see what happens.
It's dynamic, extremely interesting. And since we started on Hezbollah's beginnings in the early 80s, and we mentioned Mughniyeh, can you just finish on that, on this, what is widely suspected, and as you said, now it's been confirmed. You can tell me about how that's been confirmed. Taking him out, Damascus, Syria, 2008, in what I believe is a joint U.S.-Israeli intelligence type of operation, maybe even using proxy forces to set a bomb in place to take him out all those years later. But 2008, one of the planners of Beirut 1983 is taken out in Damascus, Syria. What can you just tell us a little bit about what happened there?
So look, Imad Mughniyeh was at the top of the hit list for both Israel and the United States for many, many, many years. and known as the Fox and the Man Who Never Sleeps, and a whole bunch of other, and the Ghost, a whole bunch of other nicknames. It was very difficult to track him down, but ultimately they did. There are a bunch of theories as to how they did that, and came up with a plan to take him out by putting an explosive in his Mitsubishi Pajero 4x4 as it came out of a meeting with Syrian military intelligence. When I wrote my book, I did not talk about the U.S. role in this at all because that was not public at the time. It came public. I think it was the Washington Post who broke it. It was in Newsweek around the same time. Washington Post then called me in to do like one of these videos to go along with their story online. The U.S. Kind of vetoed the first attempt, the first time they were ready to go operational, because they feared that there were too many civilians in the immediate vicinity, and they really wanted, probably the authority required there to be as much done as possible to mitigate against any unintended civilian casualty. The explosive device was a very sophisticated shaped device, small, but just big enough to do the trick. But even so, the U.S. said, no, let's not do this now. There was also reports that there was an opportunity to take out Qasem Soleimani in one of these meetings, and that was vetoed. But they had another opportunity, and Mughniyeh comes out of this meeting with Syrian military intelligence one night in Damascus. There aren't others around. There were people on the ground as spotters to make sure of that, to inform that he actually got into his car, and then the device went off. Nasrallah, the now late leader of Hezbollah, at Mughniyeh's funeral basically says, Israel, if you want open war, let it be open war, which was widely and correctly understood to be a threat that there would be international terrorist attacks. And it took a few months before the first of these was attempted in Baku, Azerbaijan, targeting the Israeli ambassador there and an Israel Independence Day party that was being thrown at the ambassador's home, where there were all kinds of foreign dignitaries present. I have an episode of my podcast on that plot where I interview one of the now former Israeli intelligence operatives who played a role in thwarting that plot. And then a whole bunch more followed. You had actually two series of plots going on at the same time, because this was before the Iran deal, and Iran wanted attacks carried out against the U.S., against Israel, and a little bit the U.K. as well, countries that were doing things against its nuclear program. And then at the same time, Hezbollah was trying to carry plots to avenge Mughniyeh's death. And so you had these kind of two plot lines going on at the same time for a period of time. Hezbollah's desire to avenge Mughniyeh still exists. That would involve an interest in targeting both Israel and the United States. But Hezbollah is not ISIS. ISIS, if they can kill you, they'll kill you. Hezbollah is more calculating and strategic, in some ways more dangerous, therefore. But they also have very, very long memories. And so we have long memories. You mentioned it took us 40 years to get Fuad Shukr and Ibrahim Akil and some others. But we should not fool ourselves into thinking they don't have long memories too.
I want to thank you for writing this, and people should definitely pick up Hamas right here, Hezbollah, the new version right here. Love the podcast. Love all your work. Will be links to that here in the show notes, and I encourage everyone to listen to the podcast, to go out there, read your articles as they come out so timely, and then establish a foundation for those articles and everything else that's going on in the Middle East right now by reading Hezbollah. So I want to thank you so much for all the work that you do. It's sincerely appreciated, and I'll be following along.
Right back at you. Thanks for having me back on the podcast. I really appreciate it. It's a fabulous podcast. It means a lot that you invited me to come back.
Oh, absolutely. Reach out if you ever need anything, and hopefully we'll be talking again soon.
I look forward to it. Thank you.
Take care. If you enjoyed this episode, click here to watch another episode, or click here to watch a clip from the podcast.